The mountain had been trying to kill people for 3 days straight. Not in the dramatic, cinematic way that men who had never seen real cold might imagine. Not with some clean and honorable violence. The kind of killing this mountain did was quiet, patient. It started with the wind, then the temperature, then the ice that crept into the seams of your boots and your jacket and your rifle barrel, and didn't let go until it had taken something from you. A finger, a toe, the feeling in your cheek, the certainty that you were going to make it home. Outpost Vance sat at 9,200 feet, carved into the ridgeline of the Colorado Rockies like a wound that had never healed properly. 12 men, 4 rotating watches, 1 radio that worked most of the time, 2 that worked almost never, and a commanding officer who had learned, over 24 years of service, never to trust anything that only worked most of the time. Major Roland Graves had been in the Army long enough to know the difference between a hard post and a killing post. Vance was both. He was standing over the field table at 3 in the morning when the helicopter came in low, cutting through the gray darkness with that familiar mechanical chop that always made his chest tighten. Not because he feared it, because a helicopter at this hour, in this weather, meant something had changed. And out here, when things changed, they rarely changed for the better. Sergeant First Class Everett Briggs was the one who reached the landing zone first. Briggs was a broad-shouldered man from rural Nebraska who had the particular gift of saying more with one expression than most people could manage in 10 sentences. He came back through the door of the command post 30 seconds later. The look on his face said everything before his mouth opened. Graves didn't look up from the map. "Tell me." "The replacement came in, sir." "Good." Sergeant Aaron Breck, their best marksman, had taken shrapnel through the thigh 48 hours ago. He was stable, but he was finished. The position he had held on the South Ridge had been unmanned ever since, and Graves had been losing sleep over it. "Who'd they send?" Briggs didn't answer right away. That made Graves look up. "Who?" he said again, slower this time. "Specialist Rowe, sir. Casey Rowe." The name didn't register. That wasn't unusual. Graves didn't memorize personnel files for soldiers he hadn't personally requested. He waited for Briggs to continue. But Briggs just stood there, with that look on his face, the one that meant he was deciding how to say the next part. "She just cleared the door, sir." Graves turned. She was standing in the entrance of the command post, her pack nearly as large as she was. Breck's replacement rifle, an M110 SAS, hung across her back with the practiced ease of someone who had been carrying long guns for years. The snow on her jacket hadn't fully melted yet. Her face was, and Graves would never say this out loud, not then, not to anyone, young. Shockingly young. The kind of young that made you think about your own children, or the teenagers you saw at the grocery store on weekends, who still had that unfinished quality to their faces, like the world hadn't gotten around to hardening them yet. She had dark eyes, sharp ones, and she was already scanning the room. Graves looked at her for exactly 4 seconds. Then he looked at Briggs. "Send her home." The words came out flat, not cruel. He didn't mean them cruel. He meant them the way a doctor means it when he tells you a procedure is too dangerous. Practically, logically, as the only reasonable thing to say when headquarters, in its infinite wisdom, had sent him a girl who looked like she belonged in a high school gymnasium, not a forward post in the middle of a mountain combat zone in the dead of a Colorado winter. Briggs's jaw tightened slightly. "Sir, I don't need a problem, Briggs. I need a marksman. Get her back on that helicopter and radio battalion. Tell them to send me someone who's actually—" "I can hear you, sir." The voice was quiet, not insolent, not trembling, just present, matter of fact, like she was noting something that needed to be part of the record. Graves turned back toward the door. She hadn't moved, same position, pack on her back, rifle on her shoulder. Snow still melting off her jacket. Her face hadn't changed. She was looking directly at him, not defiantly, not with the wide-eyed anxiety of someone trying to prove herself, just looking, like she was waiting for him to say something worth responding to. "How old are you, specialist?" "17, sir." The room got quiet in a very particular way. The kind of quiet that happens when something shifts in the air and every person present feels it at exactly the same moment, but nobody wants to be the first to acknowledge it. Graves studied her. He was good at reading people. 24 years of command had given him that. The ability to look at a soldier and understand in 60 seconds what kind of person was behind the uniform. He was looking for fear. He was looking for the thin, nervous energy of someone performing confidence they didn't actually have. He was looking for the tells. He didn't find them, not obviously, but she was 17, and he had learned at great cost that youth made people brave in ways that weren't always the same as being capable. Courage without skill got people killed, and it got the people beside them killed too. "Briggs," he said, "get her to the LZ." It was Lieutenant Owen Farlow who stopped him. Farlow worked the radio station at the far end of the room. He was lean and quiet, and had a way of saying things that made you feel like you'd already been thinking them and just hadn't found the words yet. "Sir," he held out a personnel folder, "you might want to look at her file before you send her back." Graves crossed the room and took it. The silence held while he read. 600 confirmed qualifying shots at distance. Not range shots, field qualification, wind adjusted, moving target, low visibility. The kind of scores that made range instructors stop what they were doing and simply watch. Her qualification assessments had comments written in the margins, things that range instructors almost never wrote because range instructors almost never felt the need. Natural wind compensation, exceptional, does not appear to calculate, appears to perceive. Graves read that last line twice. He closed the folder, looked across the room at her. She was still standing in the same position, still patient, still watching him with those dark, quiet eyes, not smiling, not trying to look impressive, just waiting. "Where did you learn to shoot?" he asked. "Montana, sir, my father." "What does he do?" "He hunts, sir, elk, mostly, long range." A half-beat pause. "He took me out when I was 8. Something moved in her eyes when she mentioned her father. Brief, very human, the kind of thing that had nothing to do with the military, nothing to do with this room or this night. Then it was gone. "He's good at reading wind," she said. "He taught me everything he knows." 8 years old, in the hills outside Havre, Montana, the wind came off the eastern slope in long, cold sheets that morning. The kind of wind that found every gap in your clothing and made a home there. Casey Rowe stood with her cheek against the stock of a rifle nearly as long as she was tall, and her father crouched behind her, one hand resting on her shoulder, as light as a question. Jim Rowe was a big man made quiet by years of patience. He had hands like worn leather and a voice he never raised, because a man who hunted the way he hunted had learned a long time ago that the mountain heard everything. "Stop fighting it," he said. "I'm not. You are. I can see it in your shoulders." His hand pressed gently. "The wind isn't your enemy, Casey. It's information. Let it tell you where the shot wants to go." She closed her eyes. She stopped pushing against the cold and let it move through her. Felt the pressure shift against her left cheek. Felt the slight lean of the pine branches at the far tree line. Felt the direction of her own breath curling away from her face, and understood, without calculating, without forcing any numbers through her head, where the air was going and what it would do to a bullet moving through it at 600 yards. She opened her eyes. She breathed out. She squeezed. The shot cracked across the valley. Far away, a branch broke exactly where she had aimed. Jim Rowe was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up, placed one hand on top of her head, and said one word. "Again." Back in the command post, the radio screamed, not a call, a scream, the way a radio sounds when the man on the other end has run out of words and is pressing the button because pressing the button is the only thing left between him and complete dissolution. Everyone in the room moved at once. Farlow got there first, pressing his headset tight, his face going from calm to blank, in the trained way of a man who has learned not to let words show on his face while they're still arriving. "Say again, Alpha. Say again, over." The voice that came back was ragged, breathless, cut through with static and wind noise, and something underneath it that was very clearly gunfire. "Pinned down, south approach. They came up through the eastern draw. We've got, I'm counting, at least 25, maybe 30, coming up the south ridge. They've got the angle on us. We cannot hold this without—" The transmission broke. Static. Farlow looked up at Graves. Graves was already at the map. The south ridge. The narrow passage at the southern face where the terrain funneled everything into a single kill corridor. The one geographic choke point that whoever controlled it controlled the entire approach to the outpost. The position that Breck had held. The position that had been unmanned for 48 hours. And then, like the mountain itself had been listening, the wind outside changed pitch. It went from cold to something else, something deeper and lower, with a howl underneath it that every man in that room recognized immediately. The blizzard. The one that had been building on the weather reports for 18 hours. The one the forecasters had rated severe. The one that was going to drop visibility to near zero and push wind speed to 50 knots or more. It was here. Graves pressed his hands flat on the map and stood very still. He was doing the math that commanders do. Not arithmetic, not logistics. The brutal, moral accounting of a man who must choose which risk is survivable and which one is not. 25 to 30 fighters moving up the south ridge in a blizzard. One rifle position that could hold that corridor, if and only if the person holding it was good enough. Good enough to shoot in 50-knot wind. Good enough to read a moving target through near-zero visibility. Good enough to hold a position alone, without support, without fallback, without anyone coming for them if it went wrong. Breck was on a cot 30 feet away with a hole in his thigh. There was no one else. Graves felt the awareness arrive in the room the way cold air arrives through a door. Not all at once, but steadily until there was no ignoring it. He saw it in Briggs's face, in Farlow's, in the faces of the other men who had turned, without quite knowing why, toward the girl standing near the door. She had heard the radio. She had heard all of it. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the map on the table, reading it with those dark, quiet eyes, the way someone reads a place they've already decided to go. Specialist. She looked up. Graves held her gaze. He would not soften what he was about to say. She had earned the truth of it the moment she walked into this room and didn't flinch. South Ridge, single shooter position, elevated, exposed. Wind from 2 directions at the top of the approach. Visibility drops to near zero in 15 minutes. He paused. I've got 25 to 30 hostiles moving up that corridor right now, and nobody who can hold that position. The room was completely silent. Can you do it? She looked at him for 2 seconds. Then she looked at the map. Her eyes moved across it with quiet, deliberate precision, not reading locations, but reading angles, reading the shape of the terrain, the geometry of what it would ask of her. 3 full seconds passed. Then she looked back up. Yes, sir. Not eagerly, not in the showy way that young soldiers sometimes answered hard questions, reaching for bravado they hoped would grow into the real thing. Just factually. The way she had answered every other question tonight, as though she had already run the same calculation he had and arrived at the same conclusion and was simply confirming it aloud. Graves stared at her. He wanted to find a reason. He wanted her file to say something different, wanted her face to show him something that would let him make another choice. He wanted very badly to be able to protect her from what he was about to send her into. But 25 men were moving up that corridor. Alpha Team was pinned. The blizzard was already outside the door. Briggs, he said quietly, get her Breck's kit. Briggs moved. Graves turned back to the map, because if he kept looking at her, he was going to say something that commanding officers did not say. Something that would cost both of them something they couldn't afford to spend tonight. He listened to the sounds of preparation behind him, the familiar rhythm of a soldier getting ready, the click of a magazine, the slide of a bolt, the whisper of clothing adjusting under body armor. And then something else, a small sound, very brief, that he almost missed entirely. Briggs found him at the table a few minutes later and kept his voice very low. "Sir," she checked the handset from Breck's kit, saw it was broken, set it aside without a word, and finished packing. Graves looked at him. "She knew the radio was out, sir, before she left. She knew she'd be going in dark." Briggs paused. "She didn't ask for different circumstances, didn't say a word about it, just adapted and kept moving." Something shifted in Graves's expression. He turned back to the map and stared at that thin line representing the South Ridge and held very still for a moment. She had known. She had seen the broken radio and understood exactly what it meant. No communications, no intelligence updates, no way to call for help. And she had simply made peace with it and walked toward the door anyway. He heard footsteps moving behind him. He turned. She was already moving. Pack settled, rifle on her shoulder, ready. "Specialist." She stopped, turned just enough to show she was listening. Graves looked at her, really looked, maybe for the first time since she'd walked through that door. This girl from Montana who had grown up reading Wind on elk trails with her father. This girl who was 17 years old and about to walk into a blizzard to hold a mountain pass alone. He wanted to give her something to carry out there, some word, some weight that mattered. The radio crackled behind him. Alpha's voice, more desperate now, splintering at the edges. The moment broke. "Watch your angles," he said. She nodded once, and she walked out into the white. Briggs came to stand beside Graves at the table. Neither of them spoke. The wind outside had already become something else, something with mass and intention, pressing against the walls of the outpost like it was looking for a way in. After a long moment, Briggs said it quietly. "She didn't flinch, sir. Not once. Not when you said send her home. Not when you asked her if she could do it. Not when she walked out that door." He paused. "I've seen a lot of men flinch." Graves said nothing. Because Briggs was right, and because some truths are heaviest when they arrive too late to change anything. When the decision has already been made, and the only direction left is forward, into the dark, into the wind, into whatever the mountain has waiting on the other side of the storm. He turned back to the map, put his hands on the surface, and he waited. The blizzard hit the outpost like a wall, not gradually, not with warning. One moment the wind was bad. The next moment it was something else entirely. A living pressure that found every seam in the building and reminded everyone inside that the mountain had opinions about who belonged on it. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees in minutes. The snow came horizontally, not falling but driving, and the world outside the command post windows reduced itself to a narrow, gray nothing that swallowed distance and depth, and the difference between ground and sky. Inside, the lights flickered once. Farlow tightened his headset and kept working the radio. Briggs stood at the secondary station and ran perimeter checks with the quiet efficiency of a man whose hands knew what to do without instruction. The other men held their positions. They were good soldiers. They understood that the worst thing you could do in a command post during an active engagement was introduce noise that wasn't information. Graves stood at the map and waited. He had been a commanding officer long enough to know that the hardest part of command was not making decisions. The hardest part was the silence after the decision, when there was nothing left to do but hold the weight of it and trust that what you had sent out into the dark was enough. He did not yet know if it was enough. Alpha Team's lead observer was still transmitting, his voice low and continuous, the voice of a man watching through binoculars and narrating what he sees, because narrating is the only thing available to him. "South approach, No contact yet. First element is still scattered below the lower traverse. They're regrouping. Looks like they're going to push again. Farlow relayed it without looking up. Graves marked the position. Then the first shot came through the radio as a sound, distant, muffled, nearly swallowed by the storm interference. But it was there, unmistakable to anyone who had spent enough time in the field to know the difference between wind noise and the particular crack of a precision rifle at distance. Then Alpha's observer, his voice sharpening into something that had not been there before. Contact, south approach, one down. A pause, the pause of a man recalibrating what he is seeing. Single shooter on the ridge. I cannot fix the position. They don't know where it's coming from. The room went still. Second contact, second target down. Another pause. Sir, they're breaking formation. They think it's multiple shooters. They're calling it in as multiple. Graves looked at the map, at that thin line, at the small symbol marking the South Ridge position. Something moved in his chest that he hadn't expected to feel tonight. Something that was not quite relief, because it was too early for relief, but that was working its way up through the cold logic of command, like something warm finding a path through ice. Briggs turned from his station. His broad face, the face that almost never showed surprise, had something in it that Graves recognized as the real thing. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say yet that the situation had not already said more precisely. Outside in the blizzard, somewhere on that ridge in 50-knot wind and near zero visibility, Casey Rowe was reading the air the way her father had taught her. And the mountain was answering. The first element's collapse bought them 8 minutes of quiet. Not silence, the radios were never silent, but the particular quiet of a situation that has shifted from active deterioration to uneasy pause. Farlow tracked the scattered remnants of the first group moving back down the lower traverse, disorganized, no longer a coherent fighting unit. Alpha confirmed 3 additional positions neutralized before the group broke entirely. 5 down, the rest running. It should have felt like progress, and it did, for approximately 4 minutes. Then the second element moved. They did not make the same mistake as the first group. They did not push up the open corridor where the terrain gave a patient shooter every advantage. They moved left, into the boulder field on the western face, a maze of natural rock formations that created walls and angles and coverage from above. It was the right tactical decision. It was exactly what a trained unit should do when a frontal approach has failed. Get into terrain that neutralizes the shooter's range advantage. In good weather, with communications, Graves could have warned her, could have updated her position, redirected her angle, given her the intelligence she needed to adjust. She had no radio. She had no way to know they had moved. Farlow said it quietly. She's lost the angle, sir. From her last confirmed position, the boulder field is blocked. She can't reach them from there. Graves looked at the map, looked at the boulder field, looked at the position marker for where she had last been seen. She knows something's wrong, Briggs said. He wasn't arguing. He was thinking out loud. The fire stopped. She'll feel the change. She can't see them in this storm, Farlow said. She doesn't need to see them. She needs to understand where they went. The room held that thought without resolving it. Then Alpha's observer came back, and his voice had changed in a way that made every man present turn toward the radio without consciously deciding to. Movement on the ridge. She's moved. She's gone higher, upper rock shelf, 40 meters above her last position. Farlow found it on the map and held his finger there for Graves to see. Graves looked at where the finger pointed and understood immediately what he was looking at. The upper rock shelf was a narrow ledge on the northern face of the ridge, completely exposed, no natural cover except the angle of the rock face itself. In clear weather, it was a marginal position. In a blizzard with 50-knot wind driving off the open northwest face, it was essentially the worst place on that mountain to try to hold still and aim a rifle. But from that shelf, there was a direct line of sight down into the boulder field. She had climbed higher into the worst of the wind to get the angle she needed. "She's firing," Alpha reported. "One down in the rocks. Two down." The observer's voice was losing its trained flatness, the professional composure starting to thin at the edges under the pressure of what he was watching. "Sir, they've got nowhere to go in there. The rocks that were supposed to be cover, she's shooting into them from above. The angle." Graves stood at the map and felt something he had no military name for. Four down in the boulder field, the remainder pressing against the far western wall of the largest boulder, using the overhang for shelter. She could not reach them from above. The angle of the rock face blocked it. But she had effectively ended the second element as an offensive force. From a position that should have been impossible to hold, he thought about the line in her file: "Does not appear to calculate, appears to perceive." He had read that line twice in this room an hour ago and understood it intellectually. He was starting to understand it in a completely different way now. The bolt problem announced itself quietly. It was Farlow who noticed first, because Farlow was the kind of officer who noticed patterns before they became problems, and problems before they became crises. He had been tracking the timing between shots from the South Ridge position, and now he set down his pen and turned to Graves with an expression that was very carefully not alarmed. "The intervals between shots are increasing, sir, significantly." Graves had already been aware of it on some level. He hadn't wanted to name it. "Bolt problem," Farlow said. "The way you say something you don't want to be true. 90 minutes. 90 minutes of wet snow and sub-zero temperatures cycling through the action of a semi-automatic rifle that had already been in the field for 2 days before she ever picked it up. The lubricant in the mechanism would be thickening, then freezing, the moving parts slowing under the accumulating weight of ice in places too small to see and too precise to forgive." She was working the bolt manually now. One shot, pump the bolt by hand. One shot, pump it again, in negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with her right hand bare because she had taken the glove off to feel the trigger from the first moment she got into position. Those fingers had been exposed to that cold for 90 minutes. Graves thought about what that meant in specific and concrete terms. He allowed himself to think about it because a commanding officer who refuses to look at what is true does not remain a commanding officer for long. He thought about what it feels like to work a rifle bolt manually when the joints in your fingers have gone from painful to numb to something beyond numb that is almost peaceful in a way that is not peaceful at all. He thought about the precision required to do it cleanly, quietly, without disturbing your sight picture, in 50-knot wind on an exposed ledge. Then he stopped thinking about it because there was nothing he could do about it from this building. The third element had been watching everything. That was the detail Graves kept returning to as Farlow's updated reports came in. The third group, the one that had started furthest back and held position through both previous engagements, had not moved. They had watched the first element scatter. They had watched the second element get driven into the boulder field. They had been patient in the way that experienced fighters are patient when they are doing something more important than moving forward. They were learning. "They're splitting, sir," Farlow said, and his voice had that quality again, the quality of a man delivering information that is worse than he had hoped. Two elements, one pushing up the main corridor, frontal approach, and one moving left, hard left, toward the western drainage ditch. Graves found the drainage ditch on the map before Farlow finished the sentence. A natural depression running along the western edge of the approach, carved by decades of snowmelt, roughly a meter deep. In good weather, visible from above. In a blizzard with near zero visibility, effectively invisible. It ran along the base of the ridge and terminated less than 30 meters from where Casey was most likely positioned. 30 meters, in a storm, from below and to the left, outside any angle she was watching. The frontal group was not trying to advance. They were trying to occupy her rifle and her eyes, to fill her attention with the corridor so that it was pointed forward while the ditch group moved up from the side she couldn't see. It was a good plan. It was the right plan. It was exactly what a competent commander does when a direct approach has failed twice. She has no comms, Farlow said. Flat, factual. The worst kind of statement because it required no interpretation. She cannot know. Graves looked at the map. He ran through every option with the methodical thoroughness of a man who has learned not to stop at the first answer that sounds like it might work. Send a runner up the south face. In this storm, on this ice, exposed the entire way. Whoever he sent would need 10 minutes minimum to reach her position, more likely 15. The ditch group would be at the terminus in 6. Fire a signal flare toward the ditch. In near-zero visibility, the light might not reach her. And even if it did, she would have no way of knowing what it meant. No code, no context. Do nothing. Trust her. Stand at this map and believe that a girl who had walked out of this building, knowing she had no radio, knowing she would be going in completely dark, had already thought about what happens when a trained enemy adapts. It was the only option that didn't cost him another soldier on that mountain. It was the hardest thing he had been asked to do all night. Sir, Briggs had been very quiet at his station for the past several minutes. He spoke now without turning around. She knew there was no radio before she left. She checked the kit, saw the broken handset, set it aside, and went anyway. He paused. She already decided how to handle going in dark. That decision is part of how she's operating out there. Graves stood very still. What Briggs was saying was not comfort. It was a tactical observation. Case Rowe had not walked out into that blizzard assuming she would have information. She had walked out expecting to work entirely from what she could observe, what she could feel, what she could read from the mountain itself. She had built that constraint into her approach from the beginning. She was not missing communications. She was operating without them by design. It was the right way to think about it. He held on to that. Then came the moment he had been bracing for without knowing it. It was not a dramatic thing. It arrived quietly, the way the most important moments in a command post always do. Buried in routine narration from a man 300 meters away, watching through binoculars in a storm. Alpha's observer. Secondary cluster. No movement from the shooter. Frontal group is reading it too. I can see 2 men from the frontal element. They've moved forward 20 meters and nothing happened. Farlow looked at Graves. 2 minutes of silence from the South Ridge position. In the middle of an active engagement, with enemy fighters beginning to probe forward. That was not a repositioning pause. That was something different. And then, before the thought had fully formed, Alpha again. Wait, she's gone. She's not at the cluster. I had her positioned 30 seconds ago and now I cannot fix her. She has moved and I cannot find her. 8 seconds of complete silence in the command post. Then a shot from somewhere that was not the cluster. Lower, closer to the ditch terminus than any position she had held before. Contact at the ditch mouth. Alpha's observer, and now the professional composure, had come apart entirely, replaced by something raw and unguarded. One down. The split group has stopped. They are in the ditch and they cannot move forward, and they cannot go back without full exposure. He stopped, started again. Sir, she was already there. She was in position before they arrived. She beat them to the terminus. Nobody in the command post spoke. Graves measured the distance on the map with 2 fingers. From the secondary cluster to the ditch terminus. 60 meters across exposed rock face in a blizzard. In the dark, in 50-knot wind, moving faster than a coordinated military unit using a concealed natural route. She had seen the plan. Without any intelligence from this building, without any radio relay, without anything except what she could observe directly from a ridge in a storm, and what she understood about how a smart enemy thinks when 2 previous plans have failed. She had solved it before it could execute. Briggs said it softly, more to himself than to the room. How did she know? There was a hillside outside Havre that Casey Rowe had sat on for 4 hours without firing a single shot. She had been 12 years old. The bull elk had entered the clearing 3 separate times, each time walking in a straight, unhurried line across open ground that should have made him an easy target. Each time, she had not fired. Jim Rowe sat beside her and said nothing, which was the most instructive thing he could have done. On the walk back, he finally asked, "Why didn't you shoot?" "It was wrong," she said. "Something was wrong. A bull that size doesn't walk straight across open ground like that unless he wants to be seen, or unless something is driving him." Her father stopped walking. He looked at her the way he very rarely looked at anyone. "Behind the East Ridge," he said. "What was there?" She thought about it. The wind direction. The sound she had heard and dismissed as nothing. The way the bull's ears had tracked left each time he crossed the clearing. Not toward her, but away from something else. "Another herd," she said. "Moving north." He was running them off his territory. "He wasn't walking toward you," Jim Rowe said quietly. "He was walking away from them. If you'd taken that shot, you'd have been standing in the middle of his herd when they came over the ridge." He started walking again. "You don't just read the target, Casey. You read what the target is responding to. The behavior tells you everything the position can't." She had been 12 years old when she learned that. She was 17 now, on a ridge in Colorado, and the frontal group had stopped advancing without being stopped. They were waiting. They were a target responding to something else, and she had gone looking for what that something was. Graves answered Briggs, and his voice was different now, changed in a way he could not have explained, but that every man in the room heard. She read the silence. He looked at the map. The frontal group stopped advancing but didn't retreat. They held their positions without pressure. That's not what pinned men look like. That's what men look like when they're waiting for something. He paused. She felt the difference, and she went looking for the real threat. Briggs was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned back to his station. Farlow said nothing at all. Outside, the blizzard pressed against the walls of the outpost with a weight that had become almost personal. The command post held. The radios kept working. The men kept doing their jobs. And somewhere on that mountain, in the white, in the cold, in the dark, the South Ridge held too. But the night was not over. The Third Element's commander had been watching everything from the beginning. He had seen 2 elements hit. He had watched the ditch group stop cold at the terminus. He was patient and he was disciplined, and he was not finished. And a patient, disciplined commander who has watched every plan fail does not retreat. He makes a new plan. Farlow looked up from his notes. "Sir, Alpha reports the command element is moving independently. Western edge of the lower corridor. He's not with the main body. He's pushing up alone." Graves found the western edge on the map. If the commander reached a position on that approach, he would have a direct line of sight to the ditch terminus area. Close enough to fix Casey's location precisely. Close enough to coordinate a final rush with the remaining fighters that was not a cautious advance, but a concentrated sprint designed to overwhelm reaction time. He would know exactly where she was, and he would come with everything he had left. "She needs to know," Briggs said. "She still has no radio." Briggs was already on his feet, already reaching for his jacket, before Graves turned around. Graves looked at him. "The face is iced. Wind is 50 knots. You understand what that means?" "I do, sir." The 2 men looked at each other across the room. 22 years between them, every hard night an impossible decision in the space that separated them. Briggs's face was completely steady, the face of a man who has already decided and is only waiting for permission. Graves gave it with a single nod. Briggs went out the door into the white. Graves turned back to the map and placed both hands against its surface and stayed there, holding the weight of what the night had asked of him, and what it was still asking, and what was still waiting on the other side of the storm to be decided. The clock on the wall kept moving. 3 minutes until the commander reached his position. 6 minutes until Briggs, if everything went right, reached hers. The arithmetic was simple, and it was terrible, and there was nothing left to do with it but wait. 3 minutes. Graves stood at the map and held that number in his chest the way you hold something that has weight, but no solution. 3 minutes until the enemy commander reached a position with direct line of sight to Casey's location. 6 minutes until Briggs, moving as fast as a man could move on iced rock in 50-knot wind, might reach her. The difference between those two numbers was not a gap. It was a verdict. Farlow was working the radio with both hands, pulling fragments of intelligence from Alpha's observer and assembling them into something coherent, the way you assemble a picture from pieces that keep moving. The frontal group was still holding at the lower corridor, waiting for the signal from their commander that would send them forward. Without that signal, they were frozen in place, disciplined enough to hold formation, dependent on the man who was currently moving up the western edge, alone in the dark. The ditch group was already neutralized. She had seen to that before Briggs ever left the building. What remained was the frontal group waiting in the corridor and the commander closing in on the western edge, and the terrible arithmetic of 3 minutes against 6. Graves stayed at the map and held the weight of it. Graves tracked it all and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. Then the shot intervals from the south ridge changed again. Not longer this time. Gone entirely. 4 minutes of complete silence from her position, and the frontal group had begun to feel it. 2 men moving forward 20 meters, then stopping, testing the quiet the way you test ice on a frozen lake, pressing your weight against it one careful step at a time to see if it holds. Farlow said it without turning around. "She's conserving, sir, working the bolt between shots. She's buying time." "Or the bolt has seized entirely," Graves said. The room did not respond to that. Both possibilities lived in the same silence, and there was no way from this building to know which one was true. Then one shot, single, from the south ridge. Alpha confirmed one man down in the frontal group. The advance stopped cold. But the pause before that shot had been long enough. Long enough for the observer to note it. Long enough for Farlow to measure it against the earlier intervals. Long enough to tell anyone paying attention that the rifle was being worked by hand between every cycle. One careful pump of the bolt in sub-zero wind, and that the hands doing that work had been bare and exposed in -20 degrees for nearly 2 hours. Graves thought about what that meant in specific and concrete terms. He had been in cold enough weather to understand what happens to hands after that kind of exposure. How the pain moves through stages. Sharp to burning, to a deep ache, to something beyond ache that is almost peaceful in a way that is not peaceful at all. How fine motor control degrades before you know it is degrading, so that the thing you are trying to do feels the same from the inside, even as it becomes less precise from the outside. He kept his hands on the map and kept his eyes on the clock. Alpha's observer had repositioned in an attempt to get eyes on the western edge, and his reports were coming in fragments now, the storm eating half of every transmission. Command element, western edge, still moving. He's close, maybe 90 seconds to a position with line of sight to the ditch terminus area. I can't get a clear angle from here. The terrain. Farlow looked at Graves. 90 seconds. And then something happened that Graves had not anticipated and could not have planned for, which was that Casey Rowe disappeared from every line of observation simultaneously. Alpha's observer, his voice stripped now of everything except the pure effort of trying to describe what he was and was not seeing. Secondary cluster, no movement. Shooter is not at the cluster. I had her position. I had it, and now she has moved and I cannot find her. I've lost the position entirely. Silence in the command post. The particular silence of men who have been tracking something carefully and have suddenly lost it and do not know yet what that means. Graves stood at the map. He looked at the position markers. He looked at the western edge where the commander was moving. He looked at the lower corridor where the frontal group was waiting for a signal that had not come. And then, because he had spent 24 years learning to read situations the way his best marksman read wind, because he had been watching Casey Rowe operate for the past 2 hours and had started to understand something about how she thought, he allowed himself to follow the logic forward to where it was pointing. The commander was moving to fix her position and direct a final coordinated rush. That was his plan, and it was the right plan, and it depended entirely on knowing where she was. She had moved before he could find her. She had not retreated to a safer position. She had not gone to ground and gone quiet. She had done the thing that made no tactical sense if you looked only at her limitations, and perfect sense if you looked at what her limitations actually were. A bolt that required manual cycling between shots was not a bolt that could sustain a rapid exchange at distance. But at 40 meters, in a blizzard, against men who did not know exactly where you were, one careful shot between pumps was a different calculation entirely. She had moved forward, toward them, closing the distance until the bolt jam stopped being decisive. She had solved the limitation by changing the geometry of the engagement. Briggs came through on the field radio, his transmission half-eaten by the storm, but the words making it through clean enough. "Recon Actual, this is Briggs. I am at the secondary cluster. She is not here. I can see her tracks. She moved toward the main corridor, sir. She went forward." "Follow the tracks," Graves said. "Already moving, sir." The frontal group had lost its nerve. Without the coordinating signal from the commander, without the confidence that comes from knowing where the shooter is and what she can reach, the disciplined holding pattern had begun to fracture at the edges. 2 men pulled back, then 3 more. The coherence of the unit dissolving the way unit coherence does when the plan has stopped working and nobody knows what the new plan is. And then Casey Rowe used the storm itself as a weapon. Graves heard it described in real time by Alpha's observer, and he listened to every word of it with both hands pressed flat on the map and something moving in his chest that he would spend a long time afterward trying to name accurately. She did not fire the flare upward. She did not fire it as a signal or a call for help or a position marker. She fired it low and horizontal, angled back and away from herself, behind the frontal group, at the white wall of blowing snow that the blizzard had built across the lower corridor. The storm caught the light and threw it back. The blowing snow behind them became a surface, a backdrop, a wall of diffused illumination that backlit every man in the frontal group with sudden and merciless clarity. 8 silhouettes, every outline, every position, every angle, all of them visible at once against the burning white. She had turned the blizzard that had been working against her all night into a floodlight. Alpha's observer, his voice now entirely unguarded. "Sir, she fired the flare behind them. They are fully backlit. I can count every man. 8 confirmed in the lower corridor, all exposed. 2 shots, 2 down." The frontal group did not regroup. It dissolved. Men running in separate directions, cover to cover, no formation, no coherence, individual survival decisions replacing unit discipline in the space of seconds. Farlow was already transmitting to the perimeter defenders before the 3rd man started running. The outpost's defensive positions opened up on the exposed and scattered remnants and finished what one rifle had started. And the organized assault that had been building up the South Ridge for 2 hours collapsed into the mountain and the storm and the dark. Alpha's observer was quiet for a moment. When he came back, his voice was that of a man who has witnessed something he does not have adequate language for and knows it. "They're leaving, sir. All elements. Everything that can move is moving downhill. They're not fighting anymore." Farlow pulled his headset back and looked at Graves. Graves did not respond immediately. He was looking at the map, at the thin line of the South Ridge, at the ditch terminus, at the position markers for 2 elements broken and 1 dissolved, and the accumulated weight of 2 hours on a single mountain represented in pencil marks on paper. She had turned the storm against them. The blizzard that had taken her radio communications, reduced her visibility to nothing, frozen her hands around a jamming bolt. She had used it as a backdrop, put the flare behind them, and let the white amplify the light. And in doing so had ended the engagement she could not have ended any other way. He was still standing there when Briggs came through on the radio again. His voice had something in it that Graves had not heard from Briggs in a very long time. Something that was not in the standard communications protocol. Something close to awe, which was not a word that applied easily to Everett Briggs under any ordinary circumstances. "Sir, I reached the western edge. The command element is down. He was already down when I arrived." A pause that carried real weight. "She dealt with him before I got there, sir. She anticipated the flanking move before I even knew about it. When I came around the rock face, the commander was on the ground, and she was standing there in the storm, looking at me." Another pause. Like she was waiting for me to catch up. Nobody in the command post spoke. Briggs continued, and now there was something careful in his voice. The care of a man delivering information he wants to get exactly right. "She looked at me and she said, 'Does the major know about the North Wire?' I told her I didn't know what she meant. She said there's a group, 4 fighters. They broke from the Eastern Scatter early in the engagement and have been working toward the North Wire for the past 40 minutes. She said she tracked them when she was crossing to the ditch." He stopped. "She said she needed to get there first." Graves was already at the North Wire section of the map, Private Hadley Strom, alone at that position since they had redirected support to the southern perimeter 3 hours ago. 1 man and 4 fighters who had been patient enough to work a flanking route for 40 minutes, while everything else on the south face burned. Graves issued the order to Farlow before the thought had fully finished forming. "Get Strom on the radio. Warn him. Hold position. Stay low. Do not engage independently. She was coming." And then, because the night had taught him something about the cost of underestimating what he was dealing with, he added one more instruction. "Do not let Strom fire at anything moving toward him from the south until it is clearly identified." He did not want the one man holding that wire shooting at the wrong person in the dark. Farlow relayed it. Strom's acknowledgement came back in one word: "Clean and ready." Graves stepped back from the table. Not far. 1 step. The physical equivalent of taking a breath. He looked at the room, at Farlow working the radio with quiet intensity, at the other men holding their positions, doing their jobs with the steady professionalism of soldiers who had chosen this life and understood what it asked of them. At the door she had walked through, twice now, going out into things that should not have been survivable, and coming back and going out again. He thought about the North Wire, about the distance from the western edge where Briggs had found her to the North Wire approach, across the face of this mountain, in a blizzard, in the dark, with a rifle that required manual cycling and hands that had been in sub-zero wind for nearly 2 hours. The math said it was not possible. He was done letting the math tell him what was possible. The North Wire radio check came back clean. Strom was in position and waiting. 4 minutes passed, then 6. The storm outside had not eased. If anything, it had deepened, the wind finding new registers, pressing against the walls of the outpost with the patience of something that understood the long game better than people did. Then the shots came. 3, fast. Faster than anything from the south face all night, because these were not distant shots. These were not wind calculations and bolt work and patience at 600 yards. These were close. The kind of shots that happen when the decision has already been made and the only remaining variable is execution. 3 shots in a pause, then 1 more, then silence. The silence that followed those 4 shots was different from all the other silences of the night. It had a specific quality to it, the quality of something finished, the particular stillness that settles over a situation when the last necessary thing has been done. Strom's voice came through. He was breathing unevenly, not from exertion, but from the aftermath of watching something happen at very close range. "Recon actual, this is North Wire, 4 hostiles down, all 4. He stopped, started again. "Sir, she was in position when they came over the wire. She had the angle before any of them knew she was there." Another pause. "She's sitting on the ground now, against the post. She's not moving." Graves was already at the door. He did not take time to issue additional instructions. Farlow knew what needed doing with the radios. Briggs was on his way back in. The engagement was over in any practical sense. There was only one thing left that required his personal attention, and it was 200 meters away at the north wire in the dark and the cold. The blizzard hit him the moment he cleared the door. The full weight of it, the cold and the horizontal snow, and the wind that did not push so much as press, continuous and absolute. He put his head down and moved along the guide rope that ran the inner perimeter, one hand on the rope and the other arm up against the worst of the wind. He heard Strom before he saw him. The private was on his feet near the wire, waving, the instinctive signal of a young soldier relieved to see senior authority arrive. Graves moved past him. She was sitting exactly as Strom had described, back against the north wire post, the rifle across her knees, head tilted back against the post, eyes open. He crossed the last few meters and crouched in front of her. "Row, sir." Her voice was roughened by cold and wind, and whatever 2.5 hours on that mountain had drawn from her in ways that would not fully show until later. "Are you hit?" "No, sir." "Certain?" "Yes, sir." She shifted slightly, and he could see what it cost her. Not injury, debt. The deep physical debt that the body presents when the emergency has passed and the account comes due all at once. Hands are slow, the cold. He looked at her hands, still loosely wrapped around the rifle. The knuckles white where the temperature had been working on the joints for hours. She had been manually cycling that bolt in sub-zero wind for the final portion of the engagement. She had fired 4 accurate shots at the north wire with those hands, at close range in the dark, 4 fighters coming over a wire they did not know she was already waiting at. He let the full weight of that land in him without deflecting it. "Can you stand?" "Yes, sir." She stood. He did not help her. He understood immediately and without needing to reason through it that she did not want help standing up, that it mattered to her, specifically and importantly, to do it herself. He stepped back and gave her the space and watched her do it slowly, with the deliberate care of someone managing a body that is very close to its limit but has not reached it. One careful movement at a time until she was upright. She had been doing that all night, he realized, managing exactly what she had, not 1 degree beyond it, not 1 degree short of it, never burning more than the situation required, never holding back what the situation demanded. Strom took her rifle when Graves asked him to, and the private handled it with a care that was notable. The care of someone who understood, without being told, what that particular weapon had done on that particular night and wanted to treat it accordingly. The walk back to the command post was slow. Graves walked beside her. Not ahead, not behind, beside. The storm worked on both of them equally, indifferently, the way the mountain had been working on everyone all night. She spoke without preamble, halfway back, her voice steady against the wind. "The North Wire Group, they were the last of the eastern scatter. I picked them up when I was crossing to the ditch, tracked them while I was engaged on the south face." "You tracked a 4-man flanking movement," Graves said, "while actively engaging 3 separate elements on the south approach." She did not respond, because it was not a question. He had said it the way you say something when you need to hear it out loud, when the words need to exist in air before they become fully real. They reached the command post door. He opened it and she walked through. The warmth of the building arrived all at once. Every man in the room turned. Farlow, the radio operators, the perimeter officers who had come in as the engagement wound down. They all turned and they all looked, and none of them said anything immediately, because sometimes the right response to something is simply to witness it without putting words on top of it before the moment is ready. She stopped just inside the door, the same place she had stood when she first arrived, 4 hours ago and a lifetime ago. Snow melting off her jacket again, same as before, except that now every person in this room knew what she had been doing since she last stood in that spot. and it made the same physical space into something completely different. Briggs came through the door 30 seconds behind them, his right arm held at an angle that indicated the shoulder wound was making itself known now that the crisis had passed. He had come down off the mountain on his own, the wound slowing him but not stopping him, the same way nothing had stopped him going up. He looked at Casey. He nodded once. She nodded back. That was the entirety of what passed between them, and it was complete. Farlow pulled his headset down and looked at his notepad, then at Graves. His voice was quiet and precise, the voice of a man delivering a final accounting. Alpha confirms, 25 neutralized across all elements. South approach, western boulder field, ditch group, frontal corridor, north wire. He paused. 25 confirmed, single shooter for the majority of the engagement. Bolt jam, no radio communications, solo position throughout. The room held that number, 25, the same number Alpha had given at the start of the night when the radio had screamed and everything had changed, and a girl with snow in her hair had looked at a map and said, "Yes, sir," in the same tone she would have used to confirm the time. Graves walked across the room and stood in front of her. 22 years of words, a vocabulary built from every hard night, every impossible decision, every moment of command that had asked more than he thought he could give. He had more words than he had ever found adequate use for. None of them were right for this. So he said the only thing that was true without anything added to it, without the weight of everything else he could have said, pressing it into something it was not. Good work, specialist. Something moved in her eyes, just briefly, just a flicker of something younger than everything she had shown him all night. Something that was 17 years old and had just come in from the cold and needed, in some very human part of itself, to hear exactly those words from exactly this person. Then it was gone. She was steady again. "Thank you, sir." Briggs started it, his good hand doing most of the work, his injured shoulder not fully cooperating, but not stopping him either. Farlow followed. Then the radio operators, then the perimeter officers, one by one, until the sound of it filled the room completely. Not organized, not ceremonial, not the performed kind of recognition that happens at formal occasions, but the genuine and spontaneous response of men who had watched something happen that they would spend the rest of their lives describing to people who would never quite believe it. Casey did not stand up, did not smile, did not raise a hand or turn toward the room. She sat with both hands wrapped around a mug of something hot that someone had quietly placed in front of her, and she looked at the floor, and she let it happen the way she had let everything happen tonight, by simply being present in it without needing it to be anything more than what it was. Graves stood in the middle of his command post and listened to it, and looked at the door she had walked through when everyone in this building thought they knew what a soldier looked like. He thought about Jim Rowe, a hunter from Montana who had taken his 8-year-old daughter out onto a snow-covered hillside and taught her not to fight the wind, but to read it, who had sat beside her in silence for 4 cold hours on a hillside to teach her that behavior tells you more than position, who had placed one hand on top of her head after her first clean shot and said one word, "Again." He did not know Jim Rowe. He would likely never meet him, but by the training and the doctrine and the accumulated discipline of years inside a structure that knows how to take raw human material and refine it into something reliable and precise. That kind of soldier is essential. Graves had been that kind of soldier once, and he had believed in that process the way a craftsman believes in his tools. But some soldiers are made by something older, something that moves through families the way weather moves through open country, from one hand to the next across years, in cold mornings, and the particular kind of love that teaches instead of protects. The kind of love that puts a rifle in an 8-year-old's hands and says, "Listen to the mountain," and means it as the most important lesson it knows how to give. The kind of love that sits in silence for 4 hours on a freezing hillside, because patience is not something you can explain. It is something you have to be shown until it becomes your own. Casey Rowe had been made by both, but it was the second kind that had carried her through the blizzard. Graves made himself a promise in the silence behind the applause, that he would never again look at a soldier and see only what they appeared to be, that the file mattered, that the scores mattered, that the notes written in the margins by instructors who had seen something they didn't have language for, those mattered most of all. But more than any credential or rank or years on a wall, the thing that mattered was this: a person who does not flinch when the world tells them to go home is worth more than anything a piece of paper can confirm. She had taught him that. In one night, on one mountain. He thought about the 4 words he had said when she first walked through that door, said them loud enough for every man in the room to hear, loud enough that there was no mistaking them for anything other than what they were. Send her home. He held those words in his chest for exactly as long as he could stand to hold them. Then he set them down. Not because they had stopped being true, they would always be true, a permanent record of a mistake made in the span of 4 seconds by a man who thought he knew what a soldier looked like. He set them down because the only thing you can do with a wrong you cannot undo is decide what kind of man you will be going forward from it. She had walked in as the kid nobody wanted. She walked out as the soldier nobody would ever forget. And somewhere in Montana, a hunter who had spent 9 years teaching his daughter to read the wind did not yet know what his patience had made possible on a ridge in Colorado in the worst storm of the season. He did not know about the South Ridge, or the boulder field, or the drainage ditch, or the flare that had turned a blizzard into a weapon. He did not know about the North Wire, or the 4 shots in the dark, or the way his daughter had sat against a fence post in sub-zero wind with her rifle across her knees and her eyes open, and waited for someone to come and tell her it was over. He would find out. And when he did, he would sit with it the way he sat with everything that mattered, quietly, without performance, letting it settle into him at its own pace. And then, if he said anything at all, it would probably be one word, the same word he had always said. The mountain knew, though. The mountain had felt every one of those 25 shots, and it had answered each one the way the mountains of Montana had answered every shot before them, with the clean and final silence of a thing done exactly right. The storm outside kept moving. The walls of Outpost Vance held. The men inside stood and listened to the sound of their own hands coming together, and understood, in the wordless way that soldiers understand the things that matter most, that they had been present for something they would carry for the rest of their lives. And Casey Rowe sat with her mug and her quiet eyes and let the warmth work its way back into her hands, 1 degree at a time, the same way she did everything, without rushing, without performance, without needing anyone to tell her it was enough, because she had always known it was enough. Her father had told her so, on a hillside in Montana, when she was 8 years old and the wind was talking, and she had learned to listen.